Is this the most studied rook endgame in the history of chess? Well, no, it's not. This is. We know that this is arguably the most studied rook endgame in the history of chess because we've spent ages studying it. We've produced loads of videos already pretty much just on this position, and then we've looked at what happens if this was a knight's pawn instead and everything shifted over. So we've spent ages studying this, so we know that it's slightly different to this position, which is not the most studied endgame in the history of chess. It is a study from 1957, but again, just like I said at the start of the last video, where like if it's a knight's pawn instead of a rook's pawn, it's like, come on, it's still sort of similar ideas. It's the same sort of thing here. Okay, we've got very similar ideas. The pawn structure's changed very slightly on the king's side. Both sides have pushed their f-pawn away from the classic wave pawn setup that we've been looking at so far. So, it's black to play in this position in this 1957 study, and yes, it's not technically the same as this position, which is, I reckon, the most studied rook endgame position in the history of chess, but we can see that they belong in the same ballpark of studying chess positions. So let's go through it. It's black to play. How does black go about drawing this position? Because it is objectively drawn. The first thing you might think to do, or hopefully one of the first things you'd think not to do, because it sort of runs counter to many of the ways black defended successfully in some of the positions in the previous videos, but it is to start checking the white king. Okay, and hopefully you thought, well, I don't want to do that, to be honest, because I know that's usually a mistake to let the white king in. Sort of, cutting off the white king is usually pretty good defense, and you would be right in that thinking. That would have been my thinking, by the way, and I've said many times that it's nice when the principled move is also the correct move. It's when, like in this circumstance, you don't want to do this because in this particular circumstance it leads to a loss. And it's like, how am I ever going to learn anything? If like there it's a win, there it's a loss, there it's a draw. How am I ever going to learn anything? So it's nice when the principled move is also the correct move. We've just actually transposed here into a 2013 Masters database game, which was won by white, and the moves just sort of followed this, actually, to be honest. Rook a3, check, king d4, rook takes g3, and in the 2013 game that we've transposed into, rook b8, which is exactly the same idea as rook c8 was the winning move. So rook c8 in this 1957 study. Black rook behind the a-pawn, check, king to f6, a-pawn gets pushed, and yeah, let's sort of see it carried on. King e6, white king is very, very active here, king c5, rook back to a1, king to b6. Black's got a choice here, I suppose, but not really. If king d5, then we see the interference idea straight away, and that's absolutely fatal, isn't it? Because we're going to be getting a queen there, so that's clearly lost. So not king d5 straight away. First of all, a check, king c6, rook back to a1, and now king d5. This is hopeless for black. They can't carry on checking because the white king's going to hide on b8 with a rook b7 block if necessary. But it's hopeless anyway. King d5 now. The rook's gone, and black's just a ridiculous number of tempi behind, I would suspect. This is just one way for white to win it. Just go and grab the g-pawn and cut the black king off. And we've got time to grab the h-pawn, stick it behind the f-pawn, and we can just earmark it for being lost on f1. So very easy win for white from there. Excuse me. So yeah, not rook a2. We don't want to let the white king cross this third rank. That would be a mistake. You might be thinking, yeah, but we don't have to keep our rook on the a file for now. Remember that when white pushes this a-pawn, they've taken away their shelter. And that looks to me like it probably would be a draw, to be honest. I think if white committed to pushing this a-pawn, Black's drawing plan's pretty simple after that, as far as I can tell. They just leave their king on g7 and leave their rook on the a file, and as soon as the white king makes contact, we'll check the hell out of it. I mean, I'm absolutely certain, actually. Sorry, I haven't investigated that, but absolutely certain that's just a draw. So white's going to be reluctant to push the a pawn. So you might, as black, think, well, okay, I'll just keep my rook on the third rank. But it wasn't necessarily just to stop the pushing of the a pawn that you wanted to keep your rook on a3. This lets the rook out, and then escape back to a3, and then we'll see a check, and then pushing the a pawn. And white's clearly made progress there. You know, we've got the a pawn one square away from promoting, which has completely tied down the black forces. And one winning plan here, amongst many others, but one that looks to me like it's going to work very nicely, is to get our king to h6. Okay. We're going to exercise plan 2, which is we're going to sacrifice the a pawn, or rather we're going to swap it for some of black's kingside pawns. I think black's pretty helpless against that plan. I'm not saying that's the only winning plan, but I mean, I'm just looking at the engine's evaluation. This is +3, so obviously it's good for white, but that looks to me to be a winning plan. So not rook b3. You can see that white's made progress there compared to the original position. Black doesn't want to play rook a3. Black wants to leave their rook on the a file, where it's doing a nice job of tying the white rook down. And he wants to keep the rook on the third rank, where it's doing a nice job of stopping the white king crossing the third rank. So it's going to be a king move, but then what king move? Now, I mean, there's king to the f file or king to the h file. You're basically your two choices. It doesn't make a lot of difference whether it's f6 or f7, or h6 or h7. The 6 or the 7 bit seems largely irrelevant as far as I can tell. Now, I found a mistake in my favourite book. It's still my favourite book, even though I found a mistake in it. And it's in this king h7 line. King h7 loses, Dvoretsky writes, and that is true. King h7 loses because of rook a7 check, king h6, king to e2, and when the rook snatches the g-pawn, this is where the mistake occurs. Okay. So Dvoretsky writes that rook b7, rook back to a3, a7, and the black king is poorly placed. That's what's written. And yeah, that's true, but g5 draws. And then after takes, king g6, the black king is not so poorly placed. This g5 push, by the way, is the key move that black needs in their defense anyway. So it's an unusual tiny little mistake there, but it is still one for white. I mean, if you think about that line, you know, I think the implication is like, we'll just bring our rook out the way, and when the black rook comes behind the a pawn, we push our a pawn and it's done. But like, it's not done because of this. It's like, oh, so what you needed to do back in this position as white is to appreciate that black's got that coming and think, right, where do we want our rook? There's only one winning move here. Everything else is drawn, and it's rook f7. So this time, if black goes for the same idea, I mean, black's completely lost here anyway, but if they did go for the same idea, we're going to pick up the black f pawn. Even this isn't trivial to win. I mean, it is a win. Rook takes a7. White should just play rook f6 and just come after the h pawn with the rook. Okay, just go after the h pawn with the rook, and if black tries to defend it, they're going to get zugzwanged fairly soon. I mean, they've just got their rook stuck in front of this pawn. The white rook and king are clearly going to mop it up if it starts getting pushed. Black's going to be running out of moves, and I guess we bring our king to the g file and push the f pawn or something. And yeah, that seems like a fairly simple win for white from there. So not king to the h file. It does eventually lose, but you would have to involve that rook f7 in this line here, just to stop black's g5 move being effective there. So there's not much left, by the way. Like, we don't want to move the rook. we don't want to move the king to the h file, so we bring the king to the f file. There's two drawing moves, king f6 and king f7, both draw. Let's see how. So king e2, this gives black a chance to mess it up straight away. So this is absolutely a move that we should, in my view, if we've been watching the other videos on parts 1 to 3 of the most studied rook endgame in the history of chess, we should just immediately know that this move's going to fail. And that's this rook takes g3. And the point is that the black king is awkwardly placed on f7, and we can simply push the a pawn. We're now threatening to shift the rook, but black needs to play rook a3 and king back to g7 to stop the skewer idea. So not rook takes g3, loses immediately. Instead, black just puts their king back on g7. It was almost like they wanted to pass a minute ago, by the way. They didn't want to move their rook from a3. They didn't really want to move their king from g7. King to the h file was no good, as we saw, so king to the f file and then back to g7. White king carries on coming over. Now we can snatch the g pawn. That allows the white rook to shift out the front. Rook back to a3, check, king f6. And I guess white's got a choice here. Dvoretsky's got as the main line rook b6 check, which at least sort of forces the king back again. But the problem with a7 is that the black king isn't forced back again. It's just sort of out, and it's active. And when the white rook is stuck in front of the pawn here, then we're always threatening a check and queening the a pawn. But now we're defending it from the side. That's not a problem. So black's just very happy to get active with their king. And then we see a bit of a blockade. Very similar to that extra trick that black had up his sleeve when we're doing the whole initial setup, but with a knight's pawn. This position. Let's see if I can quickly go through. It reminded me of this. It wasn't difficult to be reminded of this because I recorded that video today. Yeah, that idea basically. Let's go back to. Hopefully we can see the similarity. So not a7. Let's force the black king back again. And you know, this is looking good for white, right? The king's coming over to hassle the rook. We've got this plan. What's black doing? I mean, pause the video if you want. What does black do? Looks like a mess. Well, same idea as earlier on in this video. g5 was also a good idea in the original most studied endgame in the history of chess. You know, white plays king d4, g5 is the only drawing move. So g5, yeah. I mean, white's got a choice of what to take with their f pawn or h pawn. Engine actually is just saying king b2, which I suppose just delays matters, but then still wants to take with the f pawn. I mean, if we take with the h pawn, you don't really want to give your king more work to do. It's got a lot further to go to come and catch the h pawn. So yeah, defending on taking on g5, and now when the f pawn is pushed, the white king can come back. Okay, so back to sort out an f pawn rather than an h pawn. You'd think it still looks pretty good for white, right? You know, they've got two passed pawns, one of them sort of protected there on g5, but this black f pawn is going to be just enough of a thorn in white's side, bone in the throat sort of thing to get the draw. So yeah, rook b7 check, king g6, a pawn gets pushed, rook a2 check, king back to e1, and then the black king can come into f5. Rook f7 check. If instead rook g7, then black can play rook e2 check, king f1, and then rook back to a2. So white's not really getting anywhere there. And if rook f7 check, king g6, obviously if king g4 probably loses. Yes, it does, to g6. So king back to g6, and if rook takes on f3, obviously we grab the a pawn. You think, well, hang on, how's that a draw? Because rook f6 check, we go king back to g7. White's going to come and grab the h pawn there, and I mean, we're into the sort of the Kasparian position or Klingenhorwitz setup, and we haven't got the Klingenhorwitz set up, so it's not looking good. But the white rook is awkwardly placed, and we can exploit that. It's not the Kasparian position, but we can exploit the white rook being awkwardly placed in front of those pawns. We force rook takes h5 by hitting the white h pawn. There's your rook takes h5. I mean, there's lots of different drawing moves here, but this one's quite nice. I like this one. And the white rook has nowhere to go. It has no squares. h7 or h8, obviously white probably loses that. And h6, we can just swap rooks. There's nowhere for the white king to go. We can just stay on the 6th rank. If the g pawn gets pushed, that's trivially drawn. And yeah, that was quite a nice way to finish it off. So yeah, not the most studied rook endgame in the history of chess because of the pushing of the f-pawns, but a lot of similar ideas. And king f7, king e2, and then king back to g7. And I guess the masterpiece, I suppose, what's the word? The climax of the study. That's the word these chess writers tend to use when they're talking about studies. The climax of the study is this move here, g5, which we see here in the main line, and we also see in the original position in the variation where, as far as I can tell, there's a mistake in the Dvoretsky book. In that rook b7 doesn't win because of this brilliant g5 move here. Right, that video should be a bit short. I've still managed to get it to 17 minutes, but that was only one position, an unusual position in the middle of that section. It clearly still does belong in that section, but a shorter video for a change.